Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us on another snowy day in Cambridge. We've seen spring as a myth at this point. It's a pleasure to be with you for this discussion today, the power of relationships, personalization in place, an evidence-based approach to improving economic mobility in cities. My name is Rob Watson, and I'm the executive director of the EdRedesign Lab at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I also lecture, and I have the honor of being a faculty affiliate here at the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard. For those who are not familiar with the center, the Bloomberg Center is a hub for research, teaching, and fieldwork that equips current and future local leaders with the tools to address complex urban challenges. This event is also co-sponsored by our partners at Opportunity Insights at Harvard, whose mission is to identify barriers to economic opportunity and develop scalable solutions that will empower people throughout the United States to rise out of poverty and achieve better life outcomes. I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion and would like to welcome our audience here in person and all of our friends tuning in from around the world. So I'm just going to situate us a bit in the goal of this session. It's really to discuss how place-based personalized supports are reshaping systems to meet the full spectrum of children and families' needs, whether they're academic, emotional, social, and physical. Grounded in research and real-world implementation, the discussion will review the latest evidence and feature examples from cities across the U.S. To examine how cross-sector collaboration, community leadership, and personalized supports can create the conditions for all children and youth to thrive, regardless of race, place, or income. So today we'll learn from some exemplary panelists who I'll introduce in a bit, working at the intersection of research, practice, and policy to advance social and economic mobility for millions of young people and family across the U.S. And before we get started, I'm going to do some quick framing to help us understand the type of work we'll be hearing about today. So again, at the EdRedesign Lab, we are an organization really committed to creating clear and accessible pathways for all young people and families across the U.S., thinking comprehensively prenatal to career about what is it going to look like to ensure that everyone has what they need to succeed in school and in life. A bit of what motivates us is that we know it's a well-established body of research showing that the neighborhood and the place you grow up in has an outsized influence on who you get to be later in life. Jamie, who is also a joint affiliate with Opportunity Insights, will situate us here on some of the data around economic mobility in the U.S. And why it calls us to action. But I just wanted to show you here two maps. One is of my hometown of Poughkeepsie, New York, the North Side neighborhood where I grew up in, and Tauheedah's hometown of Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the East End neighborhood. Both of our census tracts and neighborhoods where we grew up in, someone who grew up in a low-income household like we both did, goes on to earn about $14,000 as an adult. In the north side of Poughkeepsie, New York, along with that economic mobility challenge, about 50% of young people who grew up in that neighborhood will be incarcerated at some point in their life. And we know that the neighborhood and place that you grow up in doesn't just shape your academic or your economic outcomes, it even shapes how long you live. So in that same north side neighborhood of Poughkeepsie, on average, someone that lives in that neighborhood lives to be about 73 years old. And in nearby neighborhoods, even in a small city of 30,000, you live as long as 85 or 90 years old. So again, we're really motivated by the question of how can we disrupt intergenerational challenges? What are the interventions that we need to think about when we center place to create pathways to social and economic mobility? So at the EdRedesign Lab, we believe there's two kind of key things you need to do to tackle some of these big challenges. One is you need to, at the local level, in cities, get institutions to work together across sector to improve outcomes that we care about at the community level. But we also need to ensure that we have strategies that meet every young person and family where they are and give them what they need to succeed in school and in life. I think many of you in this room could trace back your trajectory to caring adults, to individuals who helped you along the way to reach where you are now. So we're going to hear a bit more about this question of personalization, why we're so excited about the transformative work happening across the country. Another thing that we did earlier this fall on a prior event on the Bloomberg Center for Cities was to talk about this emergent field that we're really proud to be a part of, a field that thinks comprehensively about place, prenatal to career, literally thinking about everything young people and families need from when a household is expecting a child, all the way to when that young person becomes an adult. And we really believe that this is a new field about how we think about tackling what's necessary to improve outcomes in the U.S. We talk often that in the early 20th century, we created the field of public health in this country because we knew it wasn't sufficient to intervene with doctors and nurses when people got sick. We needed to think about the social determinants. We know that 80% of health outcomes are shaped by what happens outside of the doctor's office. We also know that kids spend only 20% of their waking hours between kindergarten and 12th grade in a classroom. 80% is spent outside of school. We're bolstered by now decades of work across the country showing that these types of cross-sector collaborations that improve outcomes for kids are a leading way to think about addressing some of the big problems of the day. And so we're really excited to take another chapter this spring with you all in today's conversation about what this emergent field is doing through personalization. Finally, I'll just say we're here at the Bloomberg Center for Cities, laser focused on the role that mayors and city leaders can play in city government as a part of a broader ecosystem. We heard earlier this fall from our friends in Tulsa and Orlando about the transformative work that was happening to reimagine neighborhoods, to create these cradle-to-career pathways to economic opportunity. And so we really think some of what you hear about today is going to talk in really specific terms about what role cities can play in creating personalized supports for kids. So finally, we're going to hear in a bit about some really groundbreaking research co-authored by Jamie Gracie and Cornell's Benny Goldman that really looks to understand the largest intervention around personalized supports in the U.S., communities and schools led by Ray Saldaña. So we're going to really situate this both from what we're seeing in cities and then some really important new research findings that we co-sponsored at EdRedesign with Opportunity Insights in partnership with Benny and Jamie as co-authors. That's really going to get to what we're learning about the role that personalized supports can play, not just to improve academic outcomes, but economic mobility itself, literally helping kids rise out of poverty across generations. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Tauheedah to help situate us a bit more in the work of the EdRedesign's Institute for Success Planning, our national institute focused on questions of personalization. She's going to provide us with a bit of the state of the art on the work she's leading, some examples from places. We'll then pass it to Jamie to talk a bit about this groundbreaking research that she's co-authored and what we can learn from that. And then we'll give Ray a chance to weigh in as one of the leading practitioners in the country and a former city council member doing that. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then I'll pass it to Tauheedah. So Tauheedah Jackson is the Deputy Director of EdRedesign and Director of the Institute for Success Planning. She brings 25 years of cross-sector leadership experience working in youth development, local government, philanthropy, school districts, community schools, and out of school time. Let's give it up for Tauheedah. As I mentioned before, we're joined by Jamie Gracie, Postdoctoral Fellow at EdRedesign and Research Affiliate of Opportunity Insights and co-author with Cornell's Benny Goldman of today's featured research, When Resources Meet Relationships, the Returns to Personalized Supports for Low-Income Students. Let's give it up for Jamie. And then finally, last but not least, we're excited to welcome Ray Saldaña, President and CEO of the Communities and Schools National Office, and by all means, Senior Fellow with us at the EdRedesign Lab. Ray is also no stranger to the world of city government as a former four-term San Antonio City Council member who at age 24 was elected the youngest council person in the city's history. No big deal. Let's give it up for Ray. So with that, I'll pass it to Tauheedah to get us going.
Hi, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to speak with you all this afternoon on this such an important topic. So in 2022, we launched the Institute for Success Planning, which was built on a learning community of places that were interested in really thinking about how we individualize supports for young people. This work came out of our initial work, which started with children's cabinets, where cities play a role in really thinking about how we bring all of the people in the ecosystem together and embedding that work in that. So when we launched the Institute, it is founded on the premise of really thinking about how do we ensure that every young person is connected to a caring adult, to ensure that they are known, seen, heard, and supported, and that there's a 360-degree view of how we're thinking about that support. So it's not from a deficit-based frame around just thinking about wraparound services or needs, but how are we thinking about celebrating their strengths and the opportunities that they have to be able to have more access. When we talk about a caring adult, we call them navigators. So that one-to-one relationship-based support is really important when we think about the relational aspect of how we think about caring adults having a lot of impact on the way young people may see themselves or understanding what is in front of them around their career pathways. Raise your hand if you can think of a caring adult, a parent, a coach, someone that impacted you in your life along the way. So I see most hands raised. Unfortunately, especially post-COVID, a lot of young people feel isolated and don't have necessarily a caring adult that they may be able to say that person is there to be able to make sure that they are known, seen, heard, and supported. Across the country, we have 34 communities that send cross-sector teams of leaders, which we call the Core Four, working together to be able to build, scale, and implement a success planning strategy that really gets at those individualized needs. So if you see, we have urban, suburban, and rural places across the country where they spend time in a 2-year cohort, really thinking about how they have those personalized supports. And on the right hand of the screen, I just want to double click on the fact that the broader place-based strategy that Rob just mentioned, and really thinking about the container in which this sits, we use success planning as a vehicle to be able to get better data to understand how or what's working with young people, what the actual needs are, so that we're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall, but we really have data not only at the individualized level, but at the aggregate level. I'll just double click also on a few of the places on the screen when you think about why success planning or why personalization. The personalized relationship-based supports solves for a lot of the things you see on the screen. So chronic absenteeism, mental and physical health issues that young people may be experiencing. When we think about academic outcomes and social capital, we know Raj Chetty's work on the importance of social capital for young people, not only to be able to progress academically. We don't call this student success planning because this is not just about schools. Schools can't do it alone. It's who in that entire ecosystem can come together and support young people, and that social capital is a part of that. We have cities that are implementing this. So in the Bronx, New York, if you see Mayor Mamdani's picture on there, one of the success planning implementations, which brought the Department of Education, Department of Social Services, and their children's cabinet together, they were able to service unhoused youth and families and really think about how they reduce their chronic absenteeism rates through success planning. Mamdani adopted that as a part of his platform, and that is being scaled at the citywide level. So when we talk about the implications of this work, local implementations, and when you see good practice, a lot of times that practice can be scaled across a city, a region, or a state. Or in Orlando, Florida, they have success planning implementation from the very little to the latter part of the pipeline, all the way to age 24, where they are looking at life maps. How are we thinking about the next level of work young people have to have? And then lastly, I would say in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a lot of their Strive Together backbone work. Now the new mayor of Tulsa, Monroe Nichols, has brought that backbone work into the city as their Department of Children and Families, and they are implementing success planning, really looking at hotspots in their city and how that data can actually inform the way that they do the work. So the power of this strategy has really been cross-cutting, and entry points look different. Sometimes it is through a school system, sometimes it's through a community development corporation, sometimes it's through a city. So depending on what people are trying to solve for or what their shared outcomes are for their neighborhood will determine how people enter this work. But it is cross-sector, and that cross-sector nature is intentional so that if a leader transitions, a superintendent leaves, a mayor leaves, that it's durable and that there is a strength in the way that we think about those cross-sector boundaries. And then this lastly has been 2-generational work where we've seen families being engaged in different ways, and it has been durable across different political ideologies. So people aren't going to argue with like the success of kids. So we think about red, purple, and blue places. This has resonated. And in a lot of the communities, this is a call into community to be able to combat single-digit literacy rates in some places, or to combat the things that the community has decided needs to be true for all young people to be able to thrive. And then lastly, this is not just about a programmatic implementation. We think about success planning coupled with collaborative action, which Rob pointed out earlier, as a mechanism to be able to give us good data so that community foundations and children's cabinets and other people who are making decisions anywhere USA have a mechanism to be able to inform the way that they think about resources, inform the way that they think about policy and advocacy, and be able to shore up that system of supports. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jamie, and she is going to outline the research.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here. And kind of like Tauheedah and Rob said, I'm excited to share some new research with you all, but I want to start by adding a little bit more context to what Rob already set up thinking about economic mobility in the US. And so the goal in our research is to use the power of big data to understand economic opportunity in the US in a scientific way. And it's that combination between these large-scale administrative data sets and statistical tools from economics that's allowed our friends at Opportunity Insights here at Harvard to produce maps that look like this. Many of you may have seen this before. But essentially what we're showing here is we've sliced the country up into about 700 metro areas. And what we're showing in the colors is the average earnings in adulthood for people who grew up in these places and whose families were low income. So their parents were earning about $27,000 a year during their childhood. And you can see across the country there's huge variation. So there's places like Atlanta or Charlotte where kids go on to, maybe do worse than their parents did on average. And there are places like here in Boston or much of the Midwest where economic opportunity really seems kind of alive and well. I think the real power of using these big data sets, however, is not that we have to look at the country sort of at this macro level, but we can really zoom in to the much more local level. So we could take an example like the city of Charlotte, and we can zoom in and plot the same statistic at the local neighborhood level. And the key thing to note here is that when we do that, we're holding the scale fixed. And you can see that even in a city like this, where on average economic opportunity is low, there's, again, huge variation. So even in a city like Charlotte, there are places that look just like Boston or like Dubuque, Iowa, in terms of their economic mobility a mile or two away or even across the street. And so I think the key question is how can we support and increase economic mobility for the people who are growing up in the red areas on this map? So we know from research that one effective way to do that is to help families move from the red to the blue, for example, using a Section 8 housing voucher. There's very clear evidence that that really helps kids who have the chance to do so. But of course, there's limits to scale with that type of policy. We can't move everyone. And so at the same time, we need to be thinking about strategies that involve investing in sort of the children and families who are growing up in these red areas. And that's what I want to focus on in this new research today. And when we do that, we're going to focus on this organization, Communities in Schools, that Ray leads. What do they do? Well, at risk of oversimplifying in front of Ray, this is a program that embeds a navigator, exactly like Tauheedah said, in a high-poverty school. And their job is to connect students to the resources that they need to survive, to thrive. It's not the only program in the US that takes kind of this flavor, but from a research perspective, it's hugely attractive due to its massive scale. So they serve about 2 million students per year in 3,000 schools across the country. Just for context, that's 3 times the size of the federal Head Start program. So it really has quite substantial reach. And the basic ethos of the program, I think as Tauheedah was setting up nicely, is that many children who grow up exactly in these red neighborhoods that we were seeing on the map a minute ago face many challenges outside of school that prevent them from showing up to school consistently and from showing up to school ready to learn. And so the job of this navigator, a sort of full-time non-school employee, you can think of them like a social worker, is to connect students to the resources that they need to try to address those upstream challenges. So you can think about getting connected to things like in-school supports, tutoring programs, mentoring programs, socio-emotional support, things like that, as well as broader community resources, access to nutritious food, stable housing, healthcare, things like that. And the kind of beauty of the program and what we're here to talk about today is that it's personalized. They're going to try to meet every kid where they're at and not give them kind of this one-size-fits-all program. So that's kind of what they do at this super high level. In practice, when CIS goes into a school and begins operating, they're going to have supports for the whole school. But for the sake of what I want to talk about today, I want to simplify slightly and think about approximately 20% of the students who are going to work really closely with this navigator through what's called case management. And you can think about this as essentially a formalization of the relationship with the navigator. So it's going to involve an individual plan for the students who are kind of struggling the most, weekly check-ins, goal setting, things like that. And the question that we want to ask is, does CIS offer a cost-effective path to economic mobility for students in high-poverty schools, students growing up in these red places on the map? And so what we're going to do is try to bring it to the data and take that spirit of big data, starting with data in Texas, where we have excellent administrative records linking in-school outcomes to college attendance to labor market outcomes, and where CIS has quite a strong presence. And the first step that we're going to do is try to characterize these students who are struggling and who are most likely to work with a navigator. And what we're going to do is form two groups of students. High-risk students, students who are kind of at risk, say, of dropping out of school, most likely to work closely with the navigator. And we're going to contrast them to low-risk students, students who are in these high-poverty schools, but who themselves are on a fairly good path already. We're going to take sort of a data-driven approach to identifying these two types of students. And when we do that, we can start to characterize what do these students seem like, the students who are most likely to benefit from having access to a CIS navigator. These are students who have high absence rates. They score substantially lower, about 1.5 standard deviations lower on standardized tests than their low-risk peers. And you can see strikingly that their economic prospects are not particularly good. These kids on average go on to earn about $16,000 a year in adulthood, similar to those statistics that Rob mentioned earlier, compared to $34,000 a year for those low-risk students. So there's big differences in terms of these, in terms of the outcomes of these students, but also just in terms of levels. These are kids who, absent intervention, might not be on the path to lead kind of an economically self-sufficient life. And so what we're going to try to do to start to understand whether CIS can help their prospects improve is to think about in-school academic outcomes. And to do that, I want to take 1 minute to set up how we're going to do this analysis. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to compare test scores for these high-risk students in schools that did versus did not get CIS programs. So take all the schools, find the ones that got it, find similar schools that didn't get CIS, and focus on these high-risk struggling students and see what happens. The idea being that prior to when the program begins, regardless of which school we're thinking about, no one had access to the CIS program. It hadn't begun in the treated schools yet. Whereas to the right of the line on the graph, only students in the treated schools, not these comparison schools, would have had access to the program. And so what we're going to do when we show you this is focus on the difference in outcomes between students in the schools that did versus didn't get the program, where higher on the graph is going to indicate better performance for the CIS schools relative to these comparison schools. So what do we see in the data? Well, prior to when the program begins, we see these dots on the graph close to 0, suggesting that these schools are evolving in similar ways. We're making a good comparison, essentially, between the schools that did get CIS and these comparison schools. What happens when the program begins? Well, you see outcomes immediately start to improve for the kids who actually had access to the program. And by the time we're on the right-hand side of this graph, test scores have gone up by about 10% of a standard deviation. How should you think about that magnitude? It's essentially in line with, I think, other celebrated interventions like shrinking class sizes or hiring high-quality teachers. So this is really, I think, a success for the CIS program. We can contrast what happens with these high-risk students, the students most likely to work with the navigator, to the low-risk students and do essentially the same comparison. And when we do that, we see essentially no effect for these low-risk kids. Remember, these are kids who are anyways on a fairly good path. We take this as evidence that CIS is effective at improving exactly the students it was designed to serve, improving outcomes for the kids who are struggling. Now, when you see something like this, how can you be sure that it's, about real tangible improvements in their prospects, not something like teaching to the test or something that feels more artificial? One thing we can do is kind of fast forward in these kids' lives and think about longer run outcomes, starting with high school graduation. And when we do that with the same type of analysis, you see that we essentially repeat the same pattern. We see these big increases for the high-risk students, essentially no change for the low-risk students. And we find that high school graduation rates improve by about 3 percentage points for the high-risk students. And these are kids who, their graduation rates to begin with are not particularly high. So this is a pretty meaningful improvement. If you were to take kind of the magnitude of the program, there's tens of thousands of kids in the US who wouldn't have graduated from high school if not for an intervention like CIS. So I think that's really something to be celebrated. And before I move on to thinking about even longer run outcomes, thinking about earnings outcomes for these kids, I want to take one moment to think about how we can use this type of analysis to give quicker feedback to policymakers and practitioners in this space. So at the end of the day, I think what we should really care about are these long-run outcomes. If we say we care about improving economic mobility, we should measure whether or not an intervention actually improved economic mobility. But if you're a policymaker, you are often not in a position where you can intervene and then wait decades to find out if it was successful. You want to be able to adapt nimbly. However, that's posed a pretty big challenge in the past. However, I just showed you sort of both short-run and long-run impacts of the program. And so I think one natural question is, can these short-run outcomes be informative about future long-run impacts? Essentially, can we forecast what's going to happen using what we know about the short run? And so I want to show you the results of an exercise like that, where we take information that we see about the short run, forecast long-run effects, and compare it to the true long-run effects that we saw. So here I'm just reminding you that 3 percentage point increase that we saw, that's the true effect of CIS on high school graduation. How does that compare to a simple forecast where we only use test scores? When we do that, we get about half of the true effect. That suggests that if we had just looked at test scores and tried to guess, is this going to be effective at improving high school graduation rates, we would have, been looking in the right direction. We would have said, we think that it's going to go up, but we would have been missing about half of the true signal of what the impact of the program is. However, using the data that we have, data that we're grateful to Ray for helping us get, we can do better than just using test scores and just focusing on sort of the cognitive component of the program. We can beef it up using things like attendance and disciplinary outcomes, things that we might think capture the non-cognitive component. And you can see that when we do that, we do substantially better. We get about 80% of the true effect. In plain language, if you kind of take this seriously, it means you could implement a version of CIS and look exactly in that year and have a fairly good guess of whether this program was going to improve high school graduation rates nearly a decade later. And so I think this type of analysis is going to be helpful for policymakers going forward, allowing people to understand long-run impacts with a shorter time horizon. That being said, with my last minute or two, let me just turn to looking at the true long-run effects that we care about, these earnings impacts. And to do that, I want to set up essentially the same type of analysis, but rather than show you just the difference in outcomes between schools that did or didn't get CIS programs, we're going to look at these trends separately. So we can start by looking at our comparison schools, and you can see that in general, prior to when CIS programs begin in other schools, outcomes are generally trending down, getting worse year over year. And you see no trend break at the point where CIS begins in other schools. That's exactly what we would expect. Nothing is changing for these students. And when we look at the students in schools that actually got a CIS program, you can see that prior to when the program begins, their trend is very similar, suggesting again that we're making good comparisons between the schools that we choose. After the program begins, though, we see that the trend entirely reverses and outcomes start to improve. Students who actually got access to the program see substantial improvements in their earnings. We estimate that students who get 3 years of CIS increase their earnings by about $1,100 per year, which for these students is about 4 or 5%. Now, what drives those impacts? When we look in the data, we find that it comes from pushing students out of unemployment in their late 20s and into these stable but sort of modest paying jobs. Again, exactly consistent with the goal of the program, which is to get kids over the finish line, finish high school, and lead these economically independent lives. And so just to wrap up super quickly, I want to put a little bit more color on these numbers by thinking about the costs of the program. So we estimate that the upfront cost of 3 years of CIS, essentially like the time of the navigator and the basic infrastructure of the program, costs about $3,000 per student for 3 years. And the estimates that I show you show that they increase earnings by about $1,100 per year in their late 20s. But of course, these earnings impacts don't just come in 1 year and then vanish in subsequent years. We can extrapolate that proportional increase over the earnings lifetime of a student. And in present day value, we estimate that it increases earnings by about $36,000. Now, if you take the perspective of the government, some of that is going to get taxed back to the federal government through higher federal income taxes, and we estimate the impact on the government budget as about $7,000. I'll note that this doesn't account for the cost of any government services that CIS might help a student sign up for, SNAP, a housing voucher, something like that. But you can see that this wedge between $3,000 and $7,000 is pretty large. It's not likely that on a per student basis, CIS is signing up kids for about $4,000 worth of government services. And the relevant thing there is that it seems that CIS, from the government's perspective, might be better than cost neutral. It might be cost positive, which I think is sort of relevant for policy discussions going forward. So I'll turn it over to Ray. Skip this part.
Well, what else do I need to say to make the pitch? Good to see folks. My name is Ray Saldaña. I'm the president and CEO of Communities in Schools. So the nonprofit that we're talking about here is The Work. And I want to tell you a little bit about what's behind the research, what's behind the results, how does it actually all happen, how large are we, and what is it that we actually do? And to do that, I just also want to lift up something that our researcher Jamie described, that what made Communities in Schools attractive from a research perspective is something that I want to just hold on to for a bit, because I think it's important in this larger space about scaling things that work, which is that we have large data sets that go back several years, decades even. So we've been around as an organization for close to 50 years. So we're old. We want to celebrate that. And we're big. I want to celebrate that as well, too. We're scaled and we're about in 29 states all across the country. I'll show you what that map looks like. But to make this as real as we possibly can, I'll just begin to describe to you what it is that we do. And so to help make sense of, so tell me about this organization. How do you deliver the work, and how do you get the kind of results that Jamie's describing here? Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. And it starts with a quite simple idea that our founder began with. So the entire premise of The Work is really, it's not programs that are transforming young people's lives, it's relationships. So how do you create an organization that allows you to embed that into a place where you find most students inside schools? And so in a world of digital innovation and apps and new pedagogies, we are not a vaccine, we're not an app, we're not an AI solution, we are our people. And the people that we have delivering this work are operating in about 3,700 schools. So it's about a 4,000 person workforce. And what this looks like is quite different. And so I like to actually deliver on the assignment. The heading of this entire webinar is around personalization, relationships, and place. For us, the place is schools. And for us, the focus is around personalization. So what happens where I call home in San Antonio is a bit different than what we do in West Virginia. It's a bit different than what we may do in Chicago. But at the foundation of that work is the delivery of our staff, our site coordinator, and how that process is actually delivered inside schools. If you're just getting to know Communities in Schools, you might say, okay, is this a field? What's the kind of work? It's not early childhood education. It's not out of school time. Most folks know it as something like wraparound student services or whole child supports. We call it integrated student supports. And that is a kind of delivery. So we're not just talking about scaling people that are delivering on these results. They're personalizing it to the community. We're also scaling a process. And that process in our mind has to be evidence-based and delivered with a kind of rigor that we can actually hold up the kind of data that is important. And so when we come into relationship with a school, because again, if you've ever worked inside a school or if you're familiar with the experience of what it could be like to lead a school, at every turn, if you looked at your inbox as a superintendent or principal, there are hundreds and hundreds of pitches about a solution that will help solve a problem for you. So there are strong gatekeepers at the schoolhouse doors for a very important reason. But for us, we believe that the data needs to be driven to deliver a solution to a problem that those schools have. And so we have for a long time been an organization that has delivered on these 3 tiers of support, usually focused on what the incentive of the school is trying to drive. And so we have cut our teeth as an organization that has driven down dropout rates, that has reduced chronic absenteeism. But how do you reduce chronic absenteeism for a body of student or a student in particular who's missed 18, 20 days of school? that allows you to get into a deeper relationship with a student about what really is the problem that's preventing a student from showing up. If it is transportation issues, that's what our psych coordinator is solving. If there is a crisis at home, a parent loses a job, there is a housing instability issue, or maybe there is a unsafe space at the home, that doesn't get surfaced unless that staff, that psych coordinator, has a deep relationship and that student can actually open up. So really, this isn't rocket science. I think it's actually more complicated than that because we're dealing with elementary, middle, and high school students. And I think as somebody who has worked in these communities, has gone through these schools, we do a very good job as young people, oftentimes hiding the things that are living below the surface. And so when we think about delivering this for schools and school districts, they ask, how can you drive the kind of data around absenteeism or graduation? And we say there are 3 different ways that a psych coordinator thinks about their job. First, they have to actually adapt the goal of the school to their own plan. And if it is an attendance issue, if it's a dropout prevention focus, or if it is around discipline, then we layer in these 3 tiers of support. And so if it's an academic issue, bringing in outside intensive evidence-based tutoring or mentoring services so that the entire school can access this. Again, the idea is very simple. How do you bring a community of support into a school? When we invest so much in nonprofits that are oftentimes sitting outside the gates of that school, there's a captive audience of students and families who could use that support. But oftentimes in these communities and cities that we built, you need a PhD in systems just to navigate the local housing authority or the local food pantry. Or if you need access to an appointment with a mental health counselor, having somebody in a school who helps that student navigate that process with them is what we aim to do at communities and schools. And so we think about this, and case management was brought up. That's a sort of tier 3 one-on-one support. But we believe in the evidence, and the evidence says that if you're at a comprehensive high school in Texas and there are 3,000 students, how much impact can you have with case management? Well, we don't think caseloads should be larger than 50 to 75. If you have 200 students, you sort of lose the impact. You can't build trusting relationships. You have to add another psych coordinator, and that's the kind of science behind the work. But I want to show you now that I'm first generation American. My father was undocumented for most of his life. And so he took a lot of jobs through that process. He became a citizen in '99. And so he's had a lot of experience. He also has a lot of sayings, just like a lot of immigrant parents do. He has one for me that is in Spanish that translates really well to English, which is that the best time to plant an oak tree is 50 years ago. The next best time is now. So we were planted 50 years ago as an organization. But the problem then was that we weren't really ready to hear what our founder was describing about what schools needed to do and deliver. So when we started with one school in Atlanta, it was one school trying to really focus on 100 students. And the idea was simple. Students cannot be turned on to learning, the academics, they can't be turned on to learning until they're turned on to living. And living is the hard part. And if you as a school haven't solved for that with kind of individualized supports, building relationships, finding a caring adult to intervene, then what you're doing is actually just focusing on academics and not that 80% of the time that a student is spending outside of school where there could be significant challenges. So the great thing is that there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. So it only took us 50 years to be an overnight sensation, and we have been growing rapidly, more so. I've been CEO for the last 6 years, and we used to have a steady pace growth of about 3 to 4% year over year from 2010 to about 2020. I show up in 2020, and it was a worse time, I think, to be introduced as a CEO of an organization when the whole country shut down and we had to send 50 million students home. And I was worried as an organization whose title is Communities and Schools, 50 million students had just been sent home. And I was worried that I'd have to shut the lights off at an organization because we rely on school contracts and they pay for about 60 to 70% of our work. We're a public-private partnership. We fundraise because private dollars are flexible. And when a family member of a student loses their job and we need to put a student in a hotel for a week or two, that is a sort of private funding that is allowing us to do that with local foundations in San Antonio or Chicago or LA. But the idea is that since 2020, when I joined the organization, we're in about 2,500 schools. We're now, and that took us 40 years to get to 2,500. We're now in 3,700. So we've added 1,700 just in the last 6 years. And so what I think is happening is that the idea and the time has come for this work. And that was before the research which, I'm so grateful that what this tells us now is this is not just a dropout prevention program. It isn't just a focus on chronic absenteeism. Those are critically important. But to be able to tell the story of what happens to our students 15, 20 years later around economic mobility and earnings over a lifetime, it's a type of exciting moment for an organization. And at 3,700 schools, we're only scratching the surface of our target addressable market here. There are 60,000 Title I schools. If you're familiar with that language, it means that Title I school is a school that is serving a majority of students who are qualifying for free or reduced lunch, families who are living in low income and poverty and impacted by all of the issues that represent these low opportunity zones on the map that you saw. And so the question for us is, if we think about large scale interventions across the country, whether you're moving people from opportunity using housing vouchers from HUD, or you were establishing a pathway to higher education, which we know allows access to the American dream, now we can configure this idea of a school-based intervention, K through 12, that can do the same thing. And I think that's what's most exciting for us as we continue to see the North Star to try to serve every Title I school in the country.
I hope you guys were taking notes. This is masterclass right here, so pay attention for those of you who care about making change in communities. I want to now get in the conversation with the panelists on all sorts of things. And we'll be going to the audience in a bit. Tauheedah, I'd love for you to kick things off. One of the big ideas you put on the table earlier was the power of personalization and success planning as an entry point for cross-sector collaboration in cities. Our colleagues at the Bloomberg Center for Cities have done a lot of work on how critical it is when you want to work and collaborate across sectors to find something, a point of entry where you can get wins on the board to move the needle and improve the lives of residents in the day-to-day. Can you say more about what you see as the value proposition of personalization to cities and different types of cross-sector collaborations you're working with? We know it can be a very labor-intensive task to do the kind of work that Jamie studied and Ray is leading. How will you make the case to a mayor, senior city leaders, and their community partners to embrace these types of approaches?
So when we think about this work, success planning provides a vehicle or a mechanism to figure out what does this look like in real practice. A lot of times when we think about systems change work and you think about working in cities, you have bureaucratic systems that high level kind of theoretical talk around like what does systems change look like. So you have to have something on the ground that creates a proof point to be able to say, okay, we know that this is working. When we think about success planning embedded in a broader strategy for a city or for a school district or whatever the entry point is, it provides an opportunity for a coordinating infrastructure or a mechanism to bring all of the people in that ecosystem together to really think about how we get data to be able to inform the way that we're making decisions at the city. So if I'm speaking to a mayor, or when I spoke to a mayor, when I was doing similar work that community schools or any of this kind of work that we're thinking about centering the young person and the young person's success, we have to really be thinking about what is the community-wide vision for all young people in a city and what needs to be true for them to thrive, not just survive. So when we talk about that, this provides a mechanism to be able to think about how are we resourcing different strategies? How are we understanding gaps in the pipeline? The data from success planning will illuminate if there are a lack of mental health services for middle school students, right? We can figure out what that looks like. It will illuminate if there's a lack of basic needs services or more families are becoming unhoused, so that we're making strategic decisions and we're aligning and creating coherence between multiple strategies that might exist in a city. And lastly, I would say, a lot of times when we're sitting in Bloomberg Center for Cities and we think about mayors, a lot of times don't see education as a part of their platform. And this provides a connection point to really think about residents and families have to thrive in order for mayors to be successful in what they have to deliver on. And a lot of times we think of potholes and we think of streets and public safety, but all of this is related because when young people and families can thrive, then all of those things get solved for. So when we think about long-run outcomes, this is essential to really think about what is that entry point or mechanism in real time to be able to give a way for people to not only get data to understand how they're using resources, but to be able to make the case around what's working and then how we're leveraging the city's assets and resources to bring this together. And I'll talk a little bit more about like Tulsa, Oklahoma, putting that backbone organization and creating the Department of Children and Families. They're doing success planning through that. I talked about the Bronx, them using the success planning platform and working with young people and families that are unhoused. And now there's a citywide implementation. And then lastly, in Orlando, they rethought the way that they had service delivery for their recreation and youth services, and now have those relationship-based individualized supports at all ages and stages, from early childhood to cradle to career pipeline, to be able to fulfill the thriving and not just surviving of young people.
Thanks for that, Tauheedah. Ray, I'd love you to both react. Obviously, these research findings are huge for communities and schools. I'd love to get your reaction to them. But I'd also, as Tauheedah would say, the so what of the research. What do you think it should mean for public policy at the federal, state, and local level? And then finally, with your former city council member hat on, a recovering city council member here, what would you say to leaders in city government about the value proposition of this kind of work and how it can crosswalk across different issue areas like the ones Tauheedah spoke about? What would have been helpful to you with a CIS when you were in the city council?
Yeah. So I spent 8 years on the San Antonio City Council, and as Rob described, I was 23 when I was running for office. I remember the first door I knocked on, I was the person on the other end of it. She said, "Are you running for the city council or the student council? Because you don't look like you're old enough to be running for the city council." But I wanted to be in my community. I wanted to be part of sort of a transformation. And when you get into office, what you realize is that your agenda is really not your own. And I think what you start to see is, what are the issues that are bubbling up as the most urgent? What are the issues that have a form or even an approach to a solution? It's not that I think as elected officials, we're looking for an easy button, but we're looking for a path with evidence that tells us that if there is a problem, we can see a solution. And so some of the days that I was struggling the most to get sleep was when we'd have these big rain events. Because in a city, when you manage a city, you manage your drainage, you manage flooding issues, and those are tough scenarios, but you also know that there's a potential solution there. There's a capital reserve that you might be able to build out, infrastructure to prevent, in many cases, what we had were literal people who were dying, or you'd have water that would be rushing into people's homes. You see a solution path. It is urgent enough that it takes your attention. And what I think is important about this work is that when you are a city leader, there is a significant amount of things that you can focus your attention on, and there's a significant amount that you can ignore and not ever feel the pain of ignoring it and let it go generation after generation, overlooked and underinvested and underestimated. And I remember being in office and being really focused on, look, I'm concerned about the parks and the infrastructure, and I'm concerned about having a police and fire stations built and enough police officers to make sure that we're dealing with public safety. But what is a more long-term vision for something like economic mobility? And do I see a path to a potential solution for that? And there's places like the Bloomberg Center for Cities that are always putting out a kind of research and evidence around what strategies work. And as an elected official, I remember the time that having evidence and data that an organization or an implementation or intervention works was like gold when you're negotiating with the city council about where investments should go. And then it's only half the battle. Having data, research, and evidence, you would think, is enough to convince every community to solve for a problem. And at communities and schools, what we've constantly said to ourselves and what we're so excited about in this research is that it is not just a school-based intervention. It's not just something to be solved for with schools. We need to be very cross-collaborative as a city council, as a mayor, as a county, as a state, to try to drive something that has evidence and a path towards a solution that we think is important. And I think one of the things that I struggled with, and I think a lot of electeds struggle with, is really putting center this work of equity. Because again, you could ignore this issue, you could ignore what's happening inside schools, and perhaps, I think, deal with this high tolerance we have for other people's pain if you can ignore it. And I think what we've tried to say now is this is a moment where there is so much dislocation and disconnection. And we as an organization at communities and schools are saying that this is not just about dropout prevention. This is not just about reducing chronic absenteeism. This is about making sure that we have economic mobility to let students rise up, to really go ladder after ladder on this American dream that we believe our city or our community or our state should actually be supporting. And so I think it represents a really important evidence-based solution on an issue that sometimes doesn't get enough attention, that may have a long tail effect, but we think is quite literally, from the research, you can see the indicators in the short run to see what the investment is going to look like long term.
Thank you, Ray, for crosswalking why this kind of work is so critical for the city, for City Hall. Jamie, I would love for you to bring in the importance of personalization from a research perspective in the CIS study and the broader economics literature. So in your paper, you note that, and I quote, "Our findings add to a growing body of experimental evidence showing that social ties not only promote mobility directly, but also amplify the impact of traditional opportunity-enhancing investments, such as college access programs, emergency rent assistance, housing vouchers, and job training, when those investments are paired with mentorship and relational support." So how should we make sense of the power of personalized supports as a lever for change across different issue areas?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of an emerging body of work in economics that's pointing in this direction. So I think kind of the traditional economists' view in a very simple way would have been like, well, maybe people can't afford to live in better neighborhoods, so we should give them money and then they will figure out the best way to move there and do kind of what's right for them. We don't have to worry about it. I think there's great evidence from the folks at Opportunity Insights that, it is true that if you give people a housing voucher, some of them will be able to move to these better neighborhoods. But if you pair that with a personalized sort of housing coach that can help families move where they want, the rates at which they're able to move to these better neighborhoods are substantially higher. And if you ask them how they were able to do that, which you have to bring in a sociologist for that. That's not our skill set. But if you ask them, they say that it was really this relationship with the person who was able to understand what their situation was, help answer their questions, support them along the way, things like this. And so I think, we see our evidence as pointing to showing that this is also helpful for kids, but I think there's growing evidence that it's also helpful for adults.
Thanks for that. So we're going to go to audience questions in a moment. I'll ask one more thing, and so if folks want to get their questions ready. I think for all of us, I want to put this on the table. One thing, we know that a part of what motivates us is improving these short and long-term outcomes for children and youth. But I think one thing that we also are holding is how these interventions can be adaptable to a range of political and cultural environments. In the piece that came out on the CIS research in the Atlantic, I noted in Benny and Jamie's research findings that there's something in those findings for everyone to be excited about, no matter your politics. And so, Jamie, I'd love for you to bring us back to the academic and economic returns of CIS and their value to policymakers across the aisle. What do you find noteworthy from a nonpartisan perspective?
I think it goes back to what we were showing at the very end, thinking about the costs relative to kind of the fiscal returns. If you were to think of having this be a program that's implemented by the government, which of course comes with its own challenges. I'm not saying you would want to do it that way, but just in terms of the economics of it, it could be the case if you kind of believe that wedge between the $3,000 and the $7,000, that if you're the federal government, you could kind of run this program and it would quote unquote pay for itself. And so I think this idea that kind of investing at a young age can make people more self-sufficient in adulthood over the course of their entire lives is kind of attractive to everyone.
Thanks for that, Jamie. And Tauheedah, you talked earlier about success planning as a unifying strategy. What are you learning about the power of this work to bring together unlikely allies across the political spectrum?
We are in 34 different communities that have very different contexts. So while the principles and practices of what the success planning strategy brings to communities as we co-create an implementation with the leaders in each community might be the same, the context matters, right? But what we have seen is it has been a unifying strategy across red, blue, and purple spaces. And I think in Ohio is probably the clearest example. In Dayton, Ohio, they implemented success planning as a part of their Promised Neighborhood work. They were able to move single-digit literacy rates to double digits in a year because it is kid by kid. The reason why I might be chronically absent, or Jamie, or Ray, we all would be chronically absent, but the reasons would be different, right? And we have to go kid by kid, although we know that this is time intensive and we think about the expense, but we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost if we don't, right? The cost on the back end is that we lose a generation of young people that might not be able to reach the promise of what we talked about earlier. And I would just say it has knitted the social fabric in communities where there might not have been cohesion in that way. So across political ideologies, it has been a call in to healthcare professionals and corporations and schools around, this is not the school district issue because there are single-digit literacy rates. It is a community-wide issue that our young people are not having the opportunity or access to thrive. So we have to really be intentional about how we're thinking about that knitting and weaving together that social fabric, and that piece of it has been critical. And when we think about what is the promise of this work, and how are we thinking about the call into community and not the call out to what's the problem, but focus on a collective solution to it.
Thanks for that, Tauheedah. So Ray, I want you to build on this. So I'd love for you to help paint a picture for how CIS is being embraced in different political environments, red, purple, blue, in community contexts, urban, suburban, and rural in the U.S. What have you found noteworthy and what gives you hope during this time of rampant polarization?
Yeah, I think one of the pieces of history that like 50 years of being in this work teaches us is we weren't always communities in schools. Actually, before we were communities in schools, we were cities in schools. And because we were growing into suburban and urban, rural communities, we could no longer be cities and schools. We had to adapt ourselves because the focus was the entire community. And so when we think about our work and we're tracking where we're growing, the places, we serve 2 million students all across the country. Our highest saturation is in a place like Texas, where we've been operating for close to 40 years. And the idea when we're working with those legislators is actually very simple. I think they are moved by the data. They are moved by this public-private partnership, but they're also moved by a very simple concept, which is at some point you have to realize the pressure we're all putting on our schools and particularly our school leaders and our teachers. And we say to them quite simply that teachers cannot be mother, father, brother, social worker, therapist, the violence interrupters. What we need to do is actually help and support them, because what everybody agrees to, whether I'm in, Appalachia or I'm in Seattle, Washington, or I'm Chicago, is that walking the path as a young person is difficult and that each one of us falls. The question is, do we have a safety net and do we have a community of support behind us when we do fall? And if we are focused on trying to build a system of support inside these schools, certainly I think what we're doing is led by the data in these communities that oftentimes, again, doesn't matter if it's red, purple, or blue for us. In fact, it's in red states particularly where we're growing the fastest, because I think there is this momentum behind wanting to figure out what is customizable to my community. And this isn't a national program that doesn't adapt itself to how we should be delivering this in a place like rural Appalachia or in Los Angeles working with our school districts. That's what I think the piece that is, really important is the personalization of this work, the fact that it is led by people who are from those communities, who are supporting and lifting up. That's a sort of inside-out strategy, not an outside-in, and I think that's the only way you transform these communities.
Thanks so much for that, Ray. So we're going to get into questions. So we have about a little under 15 minutes for Q&A. We have some great questions coming in from our friends tuning in virtually, but if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bundle 2 to 3 questions at once and then give our panelists a chance to respond. So maybe I'll raise one that came in from our virtual audience, and then if other folks want to signal, Amanda here I'll bring the mic to you. We're going to ask that your questions end with a question mark. So we have a phenomenal question coming in here. About how might we create accountability systems that value relationships and social capital as much as math and reading? Given that the evidence continues to grow, do you see a world in which our accountability systems begin to better reflect conditions that lead to outcomes? Are there any bright spots that you have seen that are looking at some of these social capital factors? So that's a really phenomenal question on how can we use social capital and relationships as a mechanism in schools and in cities. Other questions from the audience?
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. The last time that I heard about CIS, I was in Atlanta and I was working for a philanthropy there, and I remember my site visit really well. So just wanted to add that personal anecdote. But one of the things that we talked about in that meeting as a philanthropy was getting philanthropy on board if the school is part of the funding. So how do you make the argument to philanthropy to increase support to a school when they kind of want to see that local buy-in?
Really great question, and I appreciate that.
Sorry, let's go to one more, and then we'll let you, the panelists respond.
Hi there. Thank you. This has been really, really interesting. The thing I've been really curious about is, as we are looking at the social safety net being frayed and pulled in so many ways, what pivots are you seeing or think need to happen so that we can continue the progress that you're all seeing?
Great. So we have a piece on philanthropy. If you want to start, and you can field that, or anything you'd like, the accountability systems and social capital, and also the social safety net, and how we can react to that fraying. Want to start, Ray?
So this is a really great question about the interaction of the role philanthropy plays in scaling what works. And what I think I overlooked when I described how we have been so able to grow and scale in these red, blue, purple communities is the idea of leverage and the role that philanthropy has played to allow us to prove the concept works. And the sort of the direction that we've taken with philanthropy that says if you are a dollar to leverage, that school district itself has access to kind of resources and funding. And if you've ever led at a school, it is a sort of jigsaw puzzle of funding and public dollars that you have to put together when you're paying for all of the things that happen inside school. So CIS as an organization, a nonprofit operating inside a school, competes with a lot of other programs or interventions. And for us, the focus is really coming in with some ability to essentially subsidize the all-in cost of our work. And I do want to say that philanthropy has evolved over the last 10 years to be very clear because we do ourselves a disservice. I'll just speak to the nonprofit community in this space of sometimes underestimating our costs so that we might look like a cheaper value. And what that ends up doing is that we undercut our ability to sustain our work. And a site coordinator for 1 year is not as effective as having a site coordinator for 2, 3, 4 years, 10 years in some of the cases. And what we then do is essentially deflate the costs and don't actually true up the model. And so we're constantly sometimes in this cycle where philanthropy is really strong at providing a single dollar that is matched by 2 or 3 times by that school or school district. And that's what I think has allowed us to, again, prove the concept, because eventually the payer at scale for this work will be the public funding and dollars who allow us to get to 60,000 Title I schools. But the story of CIS really is the story of philanthropy taking a chance on us. We were actually funded in a very significant way. When early 2000s, $5 million for an outside third-party randomized controlled trial was so big, and we were still trying to keep the lights on. To think that we would actually invest in that in 2000 so that in 2023, researchers from Opportunity Insights would knock on the door and say, we like that you've actually studied this work and we want to layer on top of that. And so philanthropy has done a really significant job, but you're right, leveraging public dollars and who the payer at scale will be is still part of the equation to get this to every school that we think needs it.
Jamie, I'd love for you to react. I remember in intro econ, they say people respond to incentives. And so I wonder if you'd weigh in a bit on what you'd observe about, given what we've learned in the literature and this question of accountability, we hold people accountable for academic outcomes, but we're learning a lot on social capital and its value. It's, that's research has shown the leading predictor of a low-income kid rising to the middle class is cross-class relationships. Now, you and Benny have put on the table the power of these relational supports. What kind of, if not accountability, incentive structure would we be? What could we think about to really get more communities to do this sort of thing and to incentivize folks to think beyond just the traditional interventions?
Yeah, I think we're getting sort of growing evidence. Like you say, we had kind of this correlational sense that social capital was related to economic mobility, but I think there's growing causal evidence that if you could form those relationships, that they can kind of meaningfully transform kids' lives. So I think about recent work, again, from Opportunity Insights, looking at the Hope 6 program in the US, kind of a super ambitious neighborhood revitalization program. And they show that kind of the key mediator of the success of that program is whether or not this happened in communities that had some kind of cross-class mixing. And so I think kind of as we continue to build that evidence, people will see it as kind of a key thing that we should be targeting, forming these friendships, whether they're in schools, out of schools, what have you.
Thanks. Tauheedah, would love to bring you in.
As leaders, no matter where you sit in the ecosystem, whether you're a funder, an educator, a city leader, we are all responsible for stewarding not only public dollars, but whatever philanthropic dollars are being brought to the table to do this work. And when we think about that, we have to really be thinking about what is the cost of not only the opportunity to implement some of these strategies, but I think we need to start monetizing the cost of if we don't. And I said that earlier, like if we don't, what does it cost on the back end when we talk about the long tail of whatever the implications are? I think we have to talk in those ways, because for some people, the argument will be, we know that this is for the greater good, right? That's probably what motivates a lot of us in this room. But for some people, they need to see the cost in dollars, right? Around when kids are disconnected, what does that equal? And what does that mean? And I will just say, we talk about motivation or like how are we thinking about the accountability system? creating a sense of belonging. We are all humans, and that is human experience. People want to feel connected. When we think about this work, at the core of it, it is belonging. And as we think about that, there are places like Ohio where they named their success planning work in their promised neighborhood the Hope Zone. It created hope in a community that was economically distressed. You see Hope Zone signs all over. You can't go to Dayton, Ohio, and not feel that there is a movement happening with this work. So this is an opportunity to, like I said, to call people in for a collective responsibility of what the promise is that we promise not only our young people, but families in this in across the country. And it is a mindset shift. We have to really be thinking about how we are making sure that we are setting up cradle to career opportunities for young people to be able to lean into and to be able to not only in the short term, but the long term, have opportunities to have equitable access and opportunity in the long term.
Thanks so much for that, Tauheedah. Paul Revel, who's our founder and faculty director at EdRedesign, talks about one of the big ideas that drives personalization is the need to disrupt this phenomenon of anonymity. That you can go through a school, you can live in a neighborhood, and you are not, as our friends from Chelsea would say, known by name, strength, and story. So how can we disrupt this idea that you can go your entire journey in a place, in a school, in a city, and you're not seen or heard? And so I think one of the key powerful ideas of this research or the work is how can we go back to the old school, the relational capital that can drive us to do great things. I would love for our panelists to say a bit about what they think is next on the horizon. This is a seismic finding. It's been a few months for a bunch of us who are laser focused on how to create economic mobility in the U.S. Jamie mentioned the Hope 6 research. If you haven't seen that from our friends at Opportunity Insights, that was groundbreaking work on the importance of mixed income housing as a strategy for economic mobility. And a little bit before that, the CIS study. So it's just been a really big moment for a lot of practitioners and researchers and policymakers thinking about these big questions. And naturally, we want to keep going. We want to figure out what's on the horizon. So I'd love for each of you to just, from your different vantage points, what do you think we should be thinking about over the next couple of years? What excites you? What questions do you have? Where do we go from here? Ray, you want to kick it off?
Yeah. So this is an exciting time for us at Communities of Schools. Again, we're a nonprofit, largest provider of the delivery that we called integrated student supports. But we believe that at the end of the day, that we would like to grow as an organization into as many schools as possible. But the ultimate solution for us is that we really believe that the school system itself needs to be adapting a kind of process and model that focuses on this. And we think that, superintendents and principals, if the evidence of the last 5 years has taught us, the demand for this work has increased. And it's also, schools and public institutions are systems that are made up of habits and behaviors. Changing habits and behaviors is one of the most difficult things we can do from a policy perspective, from a funding perspective. And essentially, here's what I think the triad is with the decision-making that principals have. Since the pandemic, I think what we've seen is an increase in demand. And leaders of our school are thinking three things. Do I build this into my school system? Do I do it myself? Do I work with an outside organization who can deliver this work with data and evidence? We represent a solution for that. Or do we just continue to ignore it? And I think as we think of the next several years and capturing this momentum of a need that you described, which is what are the incentive structures for schools today and what do they need to focus on? And if it's just about graduation or standardized tests, then yes, you will continue to change, continue to get the replicable examples of what we see currently with the system. But if we capture the imagination, we've gotten significant amount of federal and state funding to begin to see a path for us to grow. It's going to be the public institutions themselves, school districts taking this work on. But it can't be just like one superintendent laid out to me when I was making the case about communities and schools is, look, we actually tried what you did a few years ago. We tapped the PE teacher on the shoulder, said we got this county grant, and you're going to be the student support specialist. You start on Monday. And there is more to it than that. And I think that's the kind of evidence and research that I think that we're getting behind is now the data is clear, the evidence and the process is clear, and there is an appetite and demand for this work. So we're excited that we know we're going to scale as the organization, try to meet the demand, but CIS is a proof point, but it is not the point when it comes to making sure that all students get the support they need, that we actually close the gap between those furthest from opportunity, and you use the opportunity inside schools to really build that out.
Thanks, Ray. Jamie, I'd love for you to, what's next for you? Come on, give it to us.
I'm really excited about hopefully continuing to kind of bridge between research and practice, and whether that's doing more of this type of stuff on giving quicker feedback to policymakers, things like that. I think the other thing that's really important, like, we're very lucky that CIS is so impactful, but I think it's just as important to try to understand what's not working as well, so that we can adapt and kind of put our efforts towards things that are effective. And so I'm interested in trying to kind of study a bunch of different things and get a kind of comprehensive view of what works and what doesn't. Why does it work? Why does it not?
Tauheedah?
And as EdRedesign Lab, I think we have the unique opportunity. We've launched the Institute for Success Planning. We're entering our 4th year, and we have some lessons learned. So I think continuing to spread practice and really think about how can communities across this country learn from what we know to be true around the 34 communities that have implemented. And then we also, a lot of this work, to your point, Ray, you can't just get the T-shirt and just say, hey, let's start on Monday morning. It's what does it take, and what capacities and mindset shifts do leaders in the system, and primarily adults in the system, have to accomplish to be able to do this work. So a core part of our work is talent development. So how do we continue to think about the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that leaders have to implement this? And how do we build this at scale by thinking about some of the practices that we have seen to be true that work, and then really thinking about replicating those practices across the country, so that this is just the way we do work and that this is not a special feature of any system.
Thanks, Tauheedah. So we're going to do some quick closing reflections and we'll wrap out. I'd love to bring in more of the human side of this to each of our panelists. So I want to start with Jamie. I think, want everyone to reflect on everything they'd like, but we have students in this room. And Benny and Jamie were both doctoral students here in the economics department when they first teamed up to do this incredible finding. Now they're famous in the Atlantic and getting all this coverage, but they weren't so far away from where many of you in this room are sitting right now. And I think that's a big, big important thing. Many of you are focused on big quantitative questions of what the right thing to do is. How do we improve outcomes? And Benny and Jamie got their start on this as students. So I would love for you, Jamie, to reflect on that and anything else you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing for us was teaming up with you guys and having that direct connection to people who are actually working on the ground. I kind of knew I wanted to work on things related to schools and economic mobility. And if you had asked me, what people are working on, like, maybe I could have thought of Head Start. But, it's hard, I think, to be fully connected to all the work that's happening in communities across the country. And I think having that bridge between people who are like fanatics about that work is super helpful. And there's a lot of returns to kind of having these specialized skills, but bringing them together. And I think that was totally the key for us.
Thanks, Jamie. Tauheedah?
I think this is an opportunity for us to get back in right relationship with young people. And that common phrase that it takes a village, any of us sitting up here, Rob started with my story and his story around the economic circumstances of the communities that we grew up in. I don't exist without caring adults, right? It was Miss Rose that sat on her porch and made sure I didn't ride my bike past the stop sign or she was calling my mom, right? It was Mr. Richardson that was my upward bound mentor. It was Miss Chimney, who was my volunteer services person, right? We all can think of an ecosystem of caring adults that allowed any one of us to be able to be sitting here in this space at this time. And this is generational work, right? So for my parents who grew up in the segregated South, had one less, right, opportunity than I had. And then I grew up in what people would consider impoverished circumstances. That was my reality. And now my kids are growing up in a middle class life. So when we talk about economic mobility, I think we have multiple examples in this room of how this work is generational work and allows us to, in one generation, change circumstances. So we have to lean into this. And that, to me, is the benefit or the power of the caring adult in this work in this space.
Right. Yeah, I'll just close because I buried the lead on something. I apologize. So I lead communities in schools today, but I'm actually a product of communities in schools. So I got to know the program just like our students did. And my site coordinator was Mrs. Reyes. And so for somebody who, grew up on the side of town that didn't have a lot of, college graduates, she would literally push me to think about applying to college, help me with my essays, help me cover the fees. So, and what she told me, I think, is quite impassioned for this kind of work, which is that the thing about potential is you don't know you have it until someone else tells you you do. And I've had the opportunity to meet 4,000, as many of the 4,000 Mrs. Reyes that we have all across the country in this work. And if you, again, to this question of personalization and place, if you were talking to our site coordinator in Laredo, Texas, next to the border between Mexico and the US, they would tell you about daily crossers, which is a term I didn't know, which is somebody who's going to school in the US, is a US citizen, but lives in Mexico. And the transportation solution that they had to create to make sure that they can daily cross across the bridge from customs to make it to school at 7:30 in the morning is quite incredible. And that site coordinator will tell you a story about that personalization, about that importance of place. If you were in Columbus, Ohio, where the site coordinator was figuring out a tier 3 service and was trying to focus on boys in the middle school, brought in through a nonprofit, a barbershop into the school. And if you can't, let somebody open up in a barber chair, then they'll never open up. But that is a kind of strategy for that place and that community. And in rural West Virginia, there is a site coordinator who told me about a second grader who had a toothache and had missed 20 days of school. And it was not just a toothache, that student needed a root canal, but they didn't have a specialist in that county. So they had to figure out how to get them 2 counties over, make the appointment, they go back for a referral. So everybody was involved in that. That's a question of the power of relationship and personalization, but a place. And at the end of the day, those are all incredible stories. But what it is, it's unlocking potential. And I'll sort of just end with the quote from a writer who I love, Alice Walker, who says that the most common way we give away our power is by thinking that we don't have any. And to be able to unlock that kind of power with communities all across the country, that's the point of this research, that's the point of this work, that's the point of, if something works, how can you get it to as many places as possible? So I think that's the confluence of what we get to talk about here.
Well, let's give it up to our panelists for taking us to school today. So I hope we convinced you today that relationships matter and relationships in place in cities can do much more than we ever imagined. As our hero in the field, Jeff Canada, says, despair is contagious, but hope is too. And this is a shot of hope in times where we desperately need it. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to our virtual audience. We'll see you soon. Thanks to our colleagues from the Bloomberg Center for Cities, Opportunity Insights, and EdRedesign. Sign up for our newsletters, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.